Most people remember the Battle of Helm's Deep in roughly the same way. A storm-soaked fortress at night. 10,000 Uruk-hai filling the valley below the deeping wall. Ladders slamming against stone while Legolas and Gimli compete to see who can bring down the most orcs. And then the moment when everything nearly collapses. The violent explosion that tears open the wall and floods the fortress with enemies. It is one of the most famous battle scenes ever filmed. But the battle Tolkien actually wrote was different in several important ways, and in some respects even stranger than the version most people know. There were no Elven armies standing beside the Rohirrim. The force that ultimately saved the fortress was led by a commander most viewers have never heard of. And when the sun finally rose over Helm's Deep, the soldiers of Rohan looked out across the valley and saw something that had not been there the night before. During the darkness, an entire forest had appeared where open ground had stood only hours earlier. And when Saruman's army fled into that forest, almost none of them ever came out again. To understand how Helm's Deep came so close to disaster, we need to go back several days earlier, to the moment when Rohan's western defenses were already collapsing. Saruman did not begin his invasion by attacking Helm's Deep. His first objective was the fords of Isen, the main crossing point into western Rohan, and the gateway through which any invading army would have to pass. Defending those crossings was Theodred, son of King Theoden and one of the most capable captains in the Mark. Saruman's assault came swiftly and with careful planning. His army crossed the river in strength, using a nearby bridge to threaten both sides of the Rohirrim defense at once. Theodred and his riders fought fiercely to hold the ford, but the fighting soon became chaotic around the small island at the center of the crossing. There, Theodred was surrounded by Uruk-hai. A great half-orc struck him down, and although his men managed to carry him from the battlefield, the prince died soon afterward from his wounds. With Theodred dead, the western defense of Rohan began to unravel. Saruman pressed the attack immediately. The second battle of the fords of Isen followed soon after, and although the Rohirrim fought bravely under the captains Grimbold and Helm, they could not hold against the numbers advancing toward them. Saruman's army broke through the ford and poured into the Westfold. Within only a few days, the western frontier of Rohan had collapsed, and Saruman's army, more than 10,000 strong, was now marching deep into the kingdom. At almost the same moment, events were unfolding in Edoras. Gandalf had returned. He confronted Grima Wormtongue and broke the influence that had weakened King Theoden for so long. With Wormtongue exposed and banished, the king seemed to awaken from a long shadow. His strength and clarity returned, and he immediately began gathering every rider he could spare from the capital. Theoden rode out, intending to meet Saruman's invasion in the open field. But before he reached the fords of Isen, grim news arrived. The battles had already been lost, and the Rohirrim who had defended the river were scattered across the countryside. Gandalf offered a different strategy. Instead of riding north toward the invasion, Theoden turned west toward the one stronghold in the region capable of resisting a massive assault, Helm's Deep. And here the books differ sharply from the films. In Tolkien's version, Theoden was not escorting a column of refugees or frightened civilians. He was leading roughly 1,000 experienced riders, withdrawing in good order to a fortress that could still be defended. The women and children of Rohan were elsewhere, and the king's force was entirely military. This was not a desperate flight. It was a calculated defensive move. Helm's Deep itself is often misunderstood. Technically, the name refers not to the fortress, but to the valley that runs deep into the White Mountains. At the mouth of that valley stands the fortress known as the Hornburg, a powerful stronghold originally built by the craftsmen of Gondor long before the Rohirrim ever settled these lands. The fortress had never been taken. Across the entrance to the valley stretched the Deeping Wall, a massive stone barrier nearly 20 feet high and thick enough for several men to walk along its crest. Behind that wall stood the Hornburg itself, and deeper in the valley lay the glittering caves of Aglarond, a vast cavern system capable of sheltering the defenders if the outer defenses were lost. The design created a series of choke points. Any attacking army would have to break through each defensive layer in turn before ever reaching the fortress itself. But Saruman's army was enormous. On the night of March 3rd, in the year 3019 of the Third Age, more than 10,000 Uruk-hai, Dunlendings, and Orcs marched into the valley. The battle began almost immediately. The first defensive barrier, Helm's Dike, did not hold for long. The defenders abandoned the earthwork and withdrew toward the deeping wall, where the real fighting began. Ladders rose against the stone in great numbers as attackers attempted to climb the battlements. Arrows fell from above while the Rohirrim struggled to hold their ground along the wall. Legolas fired tirelessly from the ramparts, his elven bow cutting down enemies before they could reach the top. Gimli fought beside the defenders with axe in hand, though at first he had fewer enemies within reach, something he complained about frequently given the competition he and Legolas had begun over who could slay the most orcs. For a time, the wall held. Despite the overwhelming numbers below them, the defenders repelled each assault. But Saruman's forces were not relying on ladders alone. They had discovered the weakness in the wall. At the base of the deeping wall ran a culvert, a narrow channel allowing the mountain stream to flow beneath the stone. While the defenders were focused on the attackers climbing the wall, orcs crawled through the passage beneath it. Gimli noticed the intrusion and helped block the opening, but Saruman's engineers had already prepared something far more destructive. Moments later, a violent explosion tore through the base of the wall. The blast shattered stone and sent water surging outward through the breach. When the smoke cleared, a massive gap had been ripped open in the deeping wall. Aragorn leapt down from the wall into the breach, sword drawn, crying the ancient name Elendil as enemies poured through the opening. The wall could no longer be held. What had once been a fortress was now a battlefield, with enemies inside its defenses. The defenders were forced to split. Some Rohirrim withdrew deeper into the valley toward the glittering caves, where Gimli and others helped hold the narrow entrance against repeated assaults. Aragorn, Legolas, and King Theoden withdrew into the Hornburg, the final defensive position of the fortress. Even there, the battle was far from over. Saruman's forces had revealed a weapon capable of blasting apart stone itself, and they soon turned it against the gates of the Hornburg. Aragorn stood above the shattered gateway and looked down at the army below. In Tolkien's version, he calls out to them. He warns the Uruk-hai that they do not know what the coming day will bring, and that if they remain where they stand, they will die. The orcs answer him with laughter. Moments later, another blast destroys the gateway where he had been standing. The fortress is moments away from collapse. And King Theoden makes a decision. He will not die behind walls. The great horn of Helm Hammerhand sounded through the valley, echoing against the cliffs so powerfully that stones fell from the mountainside. Theoden mounted his horse. Then the gates of the Hornburg opened. The Rohirrim charged. They burst from the fortress and drove straight into Saruman's army, cutting through the mass of enemies and riding across the valley. And then something extraordinary happened. When the riders reached the far side of the valley and turned back toward the battlefield, they realized the landscape had changed. Where open ground had stretched the evening before, there now stood a dense forest of dark trees whose branches twisted together overhead. These were the Huorns, ancient beings connected to Fangorn Forest. They had marched during the night from the north, silent and unseen. And the orcs who fled into that forest were never seen again. At the same moment the Rohirrim reached the valley floor, a rider appeared on the ridge above them, clad in white, Gandalf. Behind him came 1,000 soldiers on foot led by Erkenbrand, Lord of the Westfold, who had gathered the scattered defenders of western Rohan and returned with reinforcements at the very moment the battle was about to be lost. Together with Theoden's riders, they attacked the trapped army below. Caught between cavalry, reinforcements, and the silent forest behind them, Saruman's army collapsed. The Dunlendings surrendered, the orcs fled, and the Huorns were waiting. By the end of the battle, Saruman's invading army had been effectively destroyed. The Dunlendings were spared and sent home under oath never to cross the Isen again in war. The orcs were buried in a great mound in the valley, and the place where they fell became known as the Death Down, a barren hill where no grass ever grew again. during the night that followed, the Huorns vanished as silently as they had come. Helm's Deep had come within moments of complete disaster. The wall had been breached, the fortress nearly overrun, and the defenders pushed to the very edge of defeat. And yet the fortress did not fall. Because when the final moment came, the riders of Rohan chose to ride out and meet their fate in the open field. And in doing so, they turned what should have been the destruction of their kingdom into one of the most legendary victories of the War of the Ring.